The following is from Maurice Nicoll's book Psychological Commentaries on the Teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, Volume 3. This is from February the 2nd, 1946, on keeping the work alive in oneself. In this work, the will part of us must be affected with love of what the intellectual part knows and believes. We realize through self-observation that we do not will what we know. The emotional centre is the seat of the will. The intellectual centre is the seat of what we know. And according to the diagrams of the work, the intellectual part of us is the seat of consciousness. We have in this diagram to which I am referring, consciousness put in the top compartment, will put in the second, and attention in this third or lowest compartment. On one occasion it was said that no one can keep his aim in the work unless consciousness, will, and attention cooperate. When a man makes an aim, he usually makes it from a small side of himself, his knowledge, and very soon forgets it, that is, ceases to be conscious of it. He makes his aim from knowledge, but he is not sufficiently conscious of his aim to maintain it. In the meantime, his will, i.e. his several wills, go in different and opposite directions, and his attention is scattered in endless ways. The combination of consciousness, will, and attention is not achieved. We spoke recently of what it means to put the feeling of I into the work. In what sense can any of you say that you have a feeling of I in this work? What do you mean by it? And how often are you during the day aware of this feeling of I as something quite distinct from the ordinary changing feelings of I that we have in our general affairs of life? We are given the task of remembering ourselves at least once or twice a day. Do you find this is possible, or is it merely a matter of memory without anything real resulting? To remember oneself means to get into a quite different state in oneself. A different feeling of I belongs to this state, because it is a lifting up of consciousness to a higher level, that is, out of the so-called waking state or second state of consciousness that we have in ordinary affairs, which is peopled by small I's. To remember oneself, something of will must be contributed to the action. It is not a fault, nor can it be a matter of mere memory. Now I may remember that I have to remember myself, but not actually remember myself. That is, it remains a question of memory and nothing more. This is a common state to be in. All the same, I may attribute merit to myself in having remembered that I should remember myself. It is like remembering that you must write that letter and feeling meritorious at remembering and not writing the letter. You must need to remember yourself in order to do so, and when need comes in, will comes in. That is, I desire to remember myself. I wish to remember myself. There is a sentence that used to be given to us to say in the earlier work, I wish to remember myself. This is nothing to do with I think I should remember myself. A great deal of one's personal work is spent in thinking and not doing what we think. The will part of us is not involved, and so we go back to the opening phrase, the will part of us must be affected with love of what the intellectual part knows and believes. This marriage between the intellect and the will, so often spoken of in esoteric literature of the past, is indicated in this work by the teaching that there must be a union between new knowledge and being before any new understanding is born in a man. From knowledge alone we can and do make many intellectual decisions. In fact, we constantly make them. But all this takes place in only one centre, the intellectual centre, and the emotional centre is not involved. We have all heard how this work must be received first by the intellect, and how first of all it must be registered in the most mechanical side of the intellectual centre, i.e. the formatory part. Unless the work is well registered here, it remains weak, like imperfect French. But it will remain inoperative unless a person thinks about the ideas and applies them to his own being. Now, our will belongs to the being side of us, because it is our level of being that eventually decides what we do. Our vanity, perhaps, or our pride. I may intellectually decide to act in a certain way, but my level of being causes me to act in a quite different way. I therefore increasingly perceive something in me that acts independently and ignores my fleeting decisions. On many occasions it was said in the earlier days that the object of this work is to awaken the emotional centre, which is the seat of the will, but that this is not possible unless the intellectual part of us awakens first. What does it mean that the intellectual centre must awaken in this work? It means to begin with that we no longer take the work as something on the blackboard that we have to memorize. The next stage is that the mind begins to see the truth of the ideas of the work. When a man begins to see the truth of this work after years of personal work, he passes into a difficult stage of it, because the state of his being does not yet become affected by the truth of the knowledge taught him by the work that he sees now through intellectual centre. It might be said that this is really the first stage of the work, because then his being becomes a real problem, and the observation of his being becomes a matter of real practical concern to him. When a man begins to see the truth of this work for himself, without the help of others, he begins to have his own source of work in himself. It grows on him. He is, to a small extent, awake, that is, awake in some small part of his mind. But if he imagines that this is enough, he is greatly mistaken. In fact, he is only beginning to understand what the work means in regard to himself, and what he has to work on and why. At a recent meeting, someone said, "When you really see your position in the ray of creation, see how low down you are, and what possibilities there are. Everything begins then." This is a good observation, because it is an example of how the work can become for a moment emotional. Some pay little attention to the great cosmological diagrams, not understanding that they are a source of making the work really emotional, and so connecting the emotional centre and the intellectual centre. The ray of creation can prove the most emotional diagram of all. Now, when the work becomes emotional, it begins to affect the will part of us. It begins to affect our being. A thought does not affect our being in the same way as an emotion does. You have all noticed that some emotional crisis affects you far more deeply than any thought, and may indeed alter you for the moment. Alter what? Alter your ordinary forms of will, your desires. It no doubt sounds strange to some that the diagrams of the work really can awaken the emotions. But is it so strange when you think that all these diagrams tell us of the existence of greater mind, of what is above us, of what is greater than ourselves? You know that at present, as we are, the emotional centre is governed by self-emotions. Emotions of self-liking, of vanity, of self-love, dominate the emotional centre, and so make it so susceptible to negative emotions as when, for example, our vanity is hurt. It is only in the presence of something far greater that the emotional centre awakens to its true work, and begins to lead towards higher emotional centre. It can be said that we do not bring the ideas of the work into our mind sufficiently every day to keep the work alive in us. Every idea, every teaching, every diagram in this work belongs to one organic whole, and no side of it can be left cold for too long. We do not, for example, think nearly enough about esoteric teaching itself throughout the ages, and what its object was and from whom it came. We do not see enough difference between this teaching and life. Nor do we realize that this work can only be kept alive in us and active through conscious efforts to think about it, and to keep on rearranging it in our minds and giving it a value greater than the business of daily life. The work must be above our life eyes, however much we have to use our life eyes in our ordinary task. Otherwise the work falls down into mechanical parts of centres, and is there assailed by endless doubts, and, in short, torn to bits or indeed crucified. One significance of Christ being crucified lies in the fact that in life, esoteric teaching and psychological understanding are always dragged down and crucified by literal sensual minds. This idea is shown in the work by the fact that C influences sown into the world by conscious humanity always turn into B influences and indeed sometimes into A influences. I now wish to speak shortly about the subject of keeping the work alive in oneself once it has been formed to a certain extent. It has to be protected. That is the main point. It has to be regarded as something in us that is forming itself and that we have to be careful about. This is a curious relationship, and perhaps some of you have not realized it. You, the ordinary you in life, have to keep the work alive in you, although this you is not in the work. What the work is forming is in you, but you are not it, and so you have to keep it alive. It is like this. If you think that you can work all the time, you will have things in the wrong order. You are mistaking yourself for something forming in you to which you have to attend a great deal at intervals. No one can work all through the day and night, but you can be aware of the work in you and retain the feeling of I, that the work is in you, i.e., a continual awareness of it. This does not mean always thinking of the work while you are doing your daily tasks, because then you are in mechanical eyes and your thoughts tend to run on mechanically and create an inner confusion. On one occasion it was said in answer to some question that I have forgotten, "It will be work for you not to work." I understood this to mean, at least in one sense, that always dimly thinking of the work in the midst of life affairs and worrying about it is quite useless. Either work or do not work. And remember that all work is always a relatively conscious action. But I see no reason why a person trying to thread a needle should think it necessary to meditate on the ray of creation. I am sure that the only result would be to connect negative feelings with the ray of creation. If you get constant wrong associations with work ideas, the laying down of the work in your mind will be in a tangle. The transforming instrument will be wrongly connected. It is just like those people who are very fond of explaining how sadly they fail to remember themselves. They connect self-remembering with negative associations, so that every time they try to remember themselves, there are dragged in automatically these negative associations. You usually find that people like this enjoy being failures. To return to this early formation of the work in oneself, it can be compared, as it were, with a small new being, gradually being organized in oneself, whose will is scarcely enough to be felt as yet. If we felt it, we should feel a new will in us. When we take some life situation as work, our reaction to it is different from our mechanical reaction, and the results are different. In such a case, we behave towards the life situation more consciously according to our level of understanding. The whole power of the work in our understanding will transform every life situation, but we have no such understanding at present, and if we are sincere and do not pretend, we know this and acknowledge our knowledge. Now we can establish in ourselves with certainty that to take a life situation in a work way rather than in a mechanical way changes our relation to the life situation. This is one of the things that we can see for ourselves is so. That is, we can be certain about it. In the earlier days of this teaching, this point was often insisted on, namely, what can you be certain about in the work so far? Start from that. When we have no certainties in the work, we have no centre of gravity, no point in the work, as it is called. We have not started, or rather, this new thing has not started. It used often to be said that for some years we can only work through borrowed force, but that the time will come when this borrowed force, coming from another, is gradually withdrawn, until one has to find one's own force to continue. It is at this stage that it is necessary to establish certainties in oneself concerning the work. This demands a fresh reviewing at intervals of all the ideas of the work, and gaining another crop of meaning from them. It is only from the living ideas of the work that has life in itself that one's own work, eyes, can be kept alive. This new thing, this new being, has to be nourished until it is strong enough to maintain its own existence. For this reason we have to act in such a way as to protect this being in ourselves and nourish it. All new insights, observations and experiences that we can establish for ourselves as certainties nourish it. It is particularly the inner perception of the truth of one or another of the work ideas that nourishes it, for through this the side of the will is drawn into this new thing. When you will to do this work, your will passes through the knowledge you have of it, and the two increase. When the work in us becomes stronger than life, the whole machine reverses, is driven from the opposite end. Then the work is stronger than life. For us, however, the question is how to keep this small, weak being alive until it can become active. So we are like guardians to ourselves, and it is here that often our cleverest life eyes can help in protecting this new thing from life eyes. There are many eyes that hate the work and seek to ridicule it because they are threatened with death. It is indeed just by the struggle with these eyes that seek to destroy the work in us that this new thing sown by the work can grow and, as I said, in this clever eyes can help. One must not let doubting, slanderous, sneering eyes attack this new thing that is forming, but meet them cleverly. So one must wage war with them outside the place where the work is forming this new being in us, and not let them enter that place. They enter us, yes, but must not penetrate to that inner place we are guarding. Bad talking opens the way to this place directly and destroys anything forming there. That is why so much emphasis is laid on the danger of bad talking about the work itself.